Our next speaker, Ed Schupman, is a citizen of the Muscogee Nation of Oklahoma. He is also the manager of Native Knowledge 360 Degree. He joined the museum and the education staff in 2004. Mr. Schupman's career has led him to conduct education work in more than 170 Native American reservations and non-reservation communities nationwide. His discussion, Racism, Old and New, the Uncomfortable Relationship Between Textbooks and American Indians. There is a long history of problematic education about American Indians in the United States. This presentation examines the role that textbooks, as the primary conveyor of educational content, have played in perpetuating K-12 education about American Indians that is not only inaccurate, incomplete, and practically void of Native perspectives, but also undergirded by disturbing racial biases. So let's welcome Mr. Schupman to the podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. We couldn't let an occasion such as this go by without picking on textbooks a little bit. So, but first I would like to acknowledge that we are on traditional Native lands. These are traditional lands of the Piscataway people. And I want to acknowledge those people and their descendants who lived in this place where we are today. Textbooks have long been a dominant resource for education about Native Americans in the United States. What generation after generation of Americans have learned in schools about Native cultures and histories, what they've known and understood and carried forward in their lives and passed on to their children, has originated from a few pages of text and imagery in social studies textbooks, and of course what they've picked up from media and popular culture. Textbooks have been scrutinized, debated, and criticized for decades. Their content is highly political, and textbooks have served as the prize to be captured in culture wars, or the political and ideological struggles to control education. But while teachers are increasingly looking to other resources for use in their classrooms, looking to escape what James Loewen calls the tyranny of textbooks, they are still a considerable force. And we can't ignore the influential position they hold as sources of content and instruction in K-12 education. I care about what's happening with textbooks because they reflect the norms and priorities of the powerful and influential corners of American society. They mirror and serve to perpetuate institutionalized attitudes and perceptions. And today, millions of American school children still learn what they know about Native Americans from textbooks. But in most of Indian country, I would say there's a lot of anger and dismissive apathy about textbooks. Native people simply don't see themselves, their cultures, or their histories accurately represented in textbooks. Today, I'd like to take a brief look at the history and evolution of narratives about Native Americans in social studies textbooks and what those narratives reveal in terms of racial hierarchies and institutional power. But first, in order to understand these narratives, I think it's helpful to step back in time and look at the origins of attitudes and specifically language that has been used historically to describe Native people. Disparaging narratives started very early on. The powerful Catholic Church of the 15th and 16th centuries issued edicts to leaders of Catholic European countries who were sponsoring explorations of Africa, Asia, and of course the Americas. At the time, if people weren't Catholic, apparently they were either Saracens, Arabs, or Muslims, or pagans, mostly the non-Christian indigenous peoples of the world. And because they were not Christian, the church sanctioned taking indigenous lands and property and enslaving the people. Derogatory and racist language continued among European colonials and into the earliest formal documents of the United States. In 1776, the beloved Declaration of Independence begins with one of the most aspirational democratic statements ever made. But further down the page, it complains that England's King George is stirring up the savages of the frontier. Here, in a 1780s correspondence about the advisability of purchasing Indian lands rather than taking them by force, George Washington used the term savages, compared Native American behavior to the wild beasts of the forest, to wolves and beasts of prey. About 50 years later, in a speech before Congress, President Jackson argued for the passage of the American Indian Removal Act. He uses disparaging and patronizing language, pseudo-benevolent arguments to justify the taking of American Indian lands in the East and the removal of about 100,000 Native people west of the Mississippi to Indian Territory. But I think Jackson knew very well that his rhetoric didn't match reality. He had traveled extensively, conducted war across the Southeast for many years. Native leaders were smart politicians, diplomats, and orators. For 3 centuries already, they had managed and resisted the mounting pressures created by 3 competing European powers, colonial America, and finally the United States. Jackson knew that Native people were adapting to the world around them. At the time of removal, many Native children were educated in schools, some in Europe. Native Americans of the Southeast operated representational governments under written constitutions, really a continuation of their older traditional forms of government. They had their own laws, justice, and punitive systems. They participated in trade, owned businesses, livestock. They farmed as they always had, and some even participated in the burgeoning slavery economy of the South, a practice that Andrew Jackson would have argued was civilized. However, his language ultimately served the true purposes of the United States government because it is easier to justify the displacement and decimation of people who are feared by the masses and considered inferior and unsophisticated. To no surprise, these and many other racist and romanticized depictions of Native Americans became the institutionalized beliefs of 19th and 20th century American society. This is where we take up problematic textbook narratives. Let's start with some early examples. In 1904, The Principles of Geography, published in 1904, Richard Elwood Dodge, a professor from Columbia University, describes the 4 great races of the world. Here are some excerpts that I have to read for you. Good stuff. So the white race. The largest number of people belong to the Caucasian or white race. The members of this race have oval faces, small mouths and lips, large narrow noses, and straight eyes. They are the most active, enterprising, and imaginative race of the world. The yellow race. The next largest number of people is found in the yellow race. The people of the yellow race are shorter than those of the white race. They have coarse black hair, small noses, small black eyes. And as a rule, they are not progressive, include some of the most backward tribes of the world. The third great race is the American or red race. People of the red race have a yellowish copper-colored skin, long, coarse black hair, small round eyes. Most of the red race are but little civilized, although a few are just beginning to develop industries which will furnish products of value to the rest of the world. The fourth and last group of people is the black or Negro race. As a race, they are somewhat indolent, like other peoples whose homes are in tropical countries. They are often impulsive in their actions, but are faithful and affectionate to anyone for whom they care. There's nothing subtle about the racism in this text. It's very clear who is considered to be at the top of the racial hierarchy. Beliefs such as these permeated American society in the early 20th century. They were rooted in inherited attitudes and beliefs, justified by the pseudoscience of eugenics, and exemplary of the prevalent white supremacist values of the time. The statement about Native Americans, of course, is completely ignorant of the agricultural, engineering, environmental, governmental, and many other achievements and contributions that had served Native and other cultures for many centuries. Here's another example from 1916. Again, two professors, one from Colgate, the other from Columbia. Columbus, supposing that he had reached the Indies or southeastern Asia, called the savages who met him Indians. North America was almost an empty continent waiting for the white man to come and fill it with people. Again, nothing subtle. This is the great American narrative, the concept of manifest destiny and the heroic building of a country. It still positions Native people as savages and seems ignorant in the light of the fact that North America, and indeed the entire Western Hemisphere, was far from empty at the time of Columbus's arrival, and that it had been populated by many diverse and unique cultures since time immemorial. So how do we position early 20th century narratives such as these? Remembering that the textbooks reflect individual, institutionalized thinking of society, we are only a few generations removed from these overt statements. Millions of young children heard, believed, and lived their lives with these messages firmly instilled in their minds. Institutionalized and racist attitudes and beliefs are extremely difficult to counter and change. And just to add more perspective, the United States was doing its best in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to eradicate Native American cultures and languages through the so-called assimilationist policies and civilization acts. It only takes a small amount of empathy to recognize the impact it must have had on young Native American children to read these narratives. Although these policies and practices ultimately failed, they had disastrous and long-term consequences that still persist today in Native American communities. We'll jump ahead a few decades. By the 1950s, the language had become somewhat less derogatory and the racism less overt. But here the authors of A History of the American People say that some people thought it was the inevitable triumph of civilization over barbarism, the ability of a powerful majority to destroy a weak minority. A culture that had existed for centuries had been wiped out in 3 decades. This statement is still problematic. However, it's ignorant of the fact that there never was a single Indian culture, that neither Native peoples nor their cultures had been wiped out. And as my colleagues might also emphasize today, erasure and invisibility is just another form of racism. We'll look at one more example here. In the context of the chapter on democracy in the age of Jackson, a critical thinking question regarding the Trail of Tears, or the removal of the Cherokee people, asks, why do you think Americans were willing to give up new lands to the Indians? So this is a 2008 textbook. This is one of the powerful and most well-known publishers of textbooks today. At first sight, it may not seem racist or problematic, but there are several issues. It reveals nothing about Native American agency as peoples who were always active players in the shaping of their own lives. It's an incomplete narrative. It ignores the complex history of removal, of treaty making, of negotiations, and the long history of Native American resistance to removal. It's patronizing because it perpetuates a false benevolence narrative and that somehow the lands in Indian Territory were a gift to Native Americans, Native nations. And it features no Native perspective or voices. And finally, it's squarely positioned in the story of manifest destiny. So far, I've highlighted just a few examples across the last century to illustrate some of the problems in textbook narratives. To examine these issues from a higher level, the NMAI Education Department conducted analyses of 28 of the most commonly used textbooks in 2012 and again in 2015. We took an exhaustive look at every page, all grade levels. We noted the topics and content of the American Indian content. We measured the amount of text devoted and whether there were illustrations. We looked, mostly without success, for any examples of Native perspectives, voices, or agency. But one of the most telling findings in these analyses was that this list represents, across publishers, the most common narratives by far about Native Americans found in textbooks today. Now, to be fair, there are exceptions, but these are the big ones. What do we notice about this list? Everything up here, except for the last item, goes back 150 to thousands of years ago. Indians in the past. A good number of these stories are actually about the building of America. A couple are about the Indians that America loves to love, Pocahontas and Sacagawea. And we don't see anything about Native Americans today, the arts, the communities, the complex sovereign status of Native nations. And why do these stories persist across all publishers when so much more is possible? So what does this type of education create? What kinds of behaviors? What kinds of social issues? Last week, a perfect example occurred of how we can and should deal with racism. A well-known television journalist made casual, ignorant, and racist comments on the air about dressing up in blackface. The reaction was clear, certain, and pretty swift. The journalist lost her jobs. The comments ignited outrage, and the conversation about racism was once again front and center. In light of that, how is this still possible? How can it be deemed acceptable or somehow honoring to caricature and stereotype Native Americans as mascots of sports teams? Halloween is still a favorite time to be pretend Indians. In this slide, Halloween revelers dress up as Dakota Access Pipeline protesters. Their signs, their costumes are clearly meant to demean what was recently a serious and meaningful issue among Native Americans, including many Native American youth. Bad education about American Indians also has an impact on leaders at every level. People who make decisions, people who deal with the management of natural resources and legal issues of treaty rights, jurisdiction. Here, even a sitting president was unable to articulate what is meant by the sovereignty of Native nations. In 2015, another national politician, Rand Paul, said that Native Americans don't do very well because of their lack of assimilation. And if they were assimilated, within a decade, they'd probably be doing as well as the rest of us. This statement shows a serious lack of historical and cultural awareness. It's reminiscent of late 19th and early 20th century rhetoric that was used when the US government instituted destructive policies intended to erase Native cultures and to terminate tribal governments. We've been there before, and it didn't work. Every year, we get 1 million or so visitors to this museum. They come from all over the world, and they bring varying levels of knowledge and awareness. But there's often a surprising level of ignorance. These are just a few of the examples of the questions our interpretive staff face when they interact with visitors. So, what do we think will help to fix this? What can we do? First of all, truth is needed. America still has not come to terms with its past. Social scientists and the experiences of other countries tell us that if we don't acknowledge our past, we can't move beyond it. And we are destined to face the consequences again and again. Reconciliation is needed for healing. Reconciliation allows trust to develop. It clears the path for relationships to form and for fear to dissipate. Then change with a capital C can occur. Truth is also about replacing the inaccurate, incomplete, and stereotypic stories that we find. As our director, Kevin Gover, says, the real stories are so much more interesting. We want Americans to understand Native Americans as diverse peoples and cultures across time and space, since time immemorial to the present day. We want to teach about Native Americans as sovereign nations who've always had government systems, diplomacy with other nations, religions, people who've generated and participated in international trade and economics, engineers who built cities, agronomists who developed crops that help feed the world today, environmental managers who created sustainable landscapes, artists across time whose works belong in the world's great institutions of art, and contemporary people who live in the modern world but deeply value and work to preserve their languages, cultures, and histories. The real stories are much more interesting. We could talk about many. For instance, did you know that Native Americans have served in the United States military in every conflict, including and since the Revolutionary War? Did you know that Native Americans have served at an extremely high rate in the military, at times higher than any other group of people per capita? How is that possible in light of history? Our museum will be telling that story in the coming years and erecting a National Native American Veterans Memorial in fall of 2020. We need to see Native American perspective and agency in education. Native voices have not been silent. They haven't been voiceless. They've always been there, and they just haven't been listened to. As the actress and social activist America Ferrera has said, there's great power in getting out of the way and letting them speak for themselves. This kind of education works best in classrooms and schools that practice equity, where everyone is included, honored, and valued. We'll see improvement when teachers use culturally responsive pedagogy, where teachers cross disciplines and cultures and recognize and respect students' cultures, thereby allowing students to see themselves and their communities in their own education. We advocate for schools that, no matter where they are, practice integrated multicultural education, an approach that integrates histories, cultures, values, perspectives, regardless of the cultural makeup of the school, no matter where they are, and not just on holidays or during 1 month of the year. And finally, policy is critical to making real change happen. Many states and institutions have made great progress in implementing policy that supports the advancement of Indian education for all students, multicultural standards, and standards that support civic participation. Montana, Washington, Wisconsin, other states are leading the way and serving as models for others. The vast majority of teachers want to do the right thing. They need accurate, appropriate, authentic resources they can trust and that help them meet the academic needs of their modern classrooms. In addition, there's very little in their professional training that prepares teachers to assess the quality of the resources they use and to develop the confidence and skills they need to teach about Native histories, cultures, and contemporary lives. Perhaps it's time to construct a new American narrative, one that is more honest, inclusive, and respectful, a narrative that will require courageous conversation and patient debate to create. Courage because change is frightening to everyone, but especially those in power or who benefit from power. This remarkable object from the NMAI collection makes a powerful statement about the many different but connected parts of the United States. Nations, created in 2002 by Ute artist Jenny Ann Chapoose Taylor, uses 131,000 beads, woven together the stripes of and initials of the 50 states, but in detail that you may not even be able to see. It includes the names of 456 Native American nations, along with 4 statements that to the artist exemplify what it means to be American. One of these statements is, "Now join hand in hand, brave Americans all. By uniting we stand, by dividing we fall." John Dickinson, 1768. At the center of this issue is a bigger matter, and it's not only about Native Americans. It involves all people in the past and those who now make up the changing, complex, multifaceted, and highly multicultural place called the United States. Ultimately, it's about how we understand and tell our country's story. Real, substantive, and lasting change will happen when we prioritize and institutionalize truth, when we not only tolerate, but we embrace everything that we have been and all that we are. Then our education systems, including our textbooks, will follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed.